All right, someone's asking, is there any point in breaking in the engine after new pistons? What do you recommend? Well, so here's my take on engine break-ins. The engine does need to be broken in, and there is a process you should go through to do it. However, if the engine's built properly, it will break in almost no matter what you do. If the engine hasn't been built properly, then it won't break in no matter what you do. So the key to break in is when the engine is built. But there is some things that we would typically do here. What we found is that engines break in extremely quickly. Again, when they're built right. In fact, it could be in the first 30 seconds to a minute of it just running and idling. Um, the piston rings will seat. So what happens when an engine breaks in is when you prepare the block, there's a honing process, and that honing process leaves actually a precisely rough finish on the cylinder walls. When you put in piston rings, it's kind of like when you put new pads on your car. The piston rings are manufactured to very precise tolerances, but the piston ring doesn't necessarily precisely match the cylinder wall. And we're talking about, micro measurements here. But you want that piston in contact with the cylinder wall in a very even fashion all the way around the piston.
The piston rings in contact, yeah.
The piston ring. What did I say? Piston.
Piston.
Yeah, no, not the piston. The piston should never touch the cylinder. Maybe the skirts can, but they shouldn't. And so what happens is when you put a brand new motor together and you assemble it, you have, again, this crosshatch on your cylinder walls, and you have these brand new rings. As you start it and those pistons start moving through those bores, if the crosshatch is done properly, it will be just rough enough to wear those rings out relatively quickly, and make those rings conform precisely to the specific shape of each cylinder wall. If done correctly, the rings will perfectly conform to the cylinder wall of each cylinder, and those rings will maintain a very good seal under combustion pressure. In fact, more than 95%
Yeah,
of the pressure will stay in the combustion chamber.
and that's usually how we kind of we'll do a couple of tests throughout our break-in process. If we build a new motor, is we'll do a
Yeah.
leak down test before and a compression test before, run it through our normal, either road or dyno break-in routine, change the oil, flush out clean all that up anyway, and then do another leak down compression and kind of determine where things are at. And you can usually see it pretty quickly where you'll have some pretty big variance across the motor, from cylinder to cylinder, and as the brake for
A brand new motor.
completely undriven motor, and then after a pretty quick period, if it's breaking in properly, you'll see it, all those cylinders should level out, compression and leak down wise, and you're usually good to go at that point.
So the one thing, and there's a lot of like snake oil and wives' tales about breaking in engines, and people have like superstitions and all kinds of BS around it. But what we will do is we will start the engine on a break-in oil. Break-in oil is actually an oil that has much lower lubrication and viscosity than you want, ultimately in the motor. But the lack of, or the less lubricative property of this oil allows the abrasion to happen between the cross hatching and the rings. And so we will start and run the motor on break-in oil, typically for some amount of time. Most of these end up on our dyno, and we would do the break-in on the dyno. But I would say if you don't have a dyno, do a break-in. Drive for 5 miles. And during that time when you're driving, I think it's important to not sit at 1 RPM. So you go out on the freeway, rev up to say 4,000 RPM. Again, you don't want to rev real high either during this period, but just rev up to like 4,000 RPM, and then let off the throttle and let the engine pull down. And so that stresses the rings in both direction under acceleration and deceleration. And if you go out and you just do like a 1 mile loop and you come back to your shop, do a compression test at that point, your motor will be broken. There's no magic. You don't have to knock on anything or pray to any certain gods.
I've never seen a motor that needs anything more than
Well, we've seen motors
But
that
there's some that
built-
never break in. That's what I'm just
and,
going to
and
get
you
at.
could spend a week trying to break that thing.
And there's some people that say, oh, you drive 1,000 miles and then you're good to go. But I mean, if it takes 1,000 miles to break in a motor, there's
and
something's going on. Because I mean, could you imagine a factory motor? You can't drive the car properly for 1,000.
they don't really even break those in. They just come from the factory. You
Yeah,
start.
I think they do some run cycles at the factory.
Maybe, yeah, sure.
I don't think it's any kind of extended amount of time.
So where you run into issues is if the ring gap isn't set properly, or if the cross hatching is not enough or too much. If it's not enough, it won't wear the rings enough, and they'll never break in. If it's too much, it'll wear them too much, and then you'll be out of tolerance for the rings, and it'll leak a lot. And then also, the size of the bore, the overbore over the size of the piston is critical, because that determines how much play there is between the rings.
Yep. And then, what the piston material and design is will change how much, how much that expands or grows and how much room there is between the piston and the walls. So, yeah, there's a lot that goes into it.
Not a lot of people building motors these days, but if you do,
Yeah.
I recommend working with a good shop, a good machine shop that knows what they're doing. That makes all the difference. So,